Hello and welcome back to this video, and today we're going to talk about the survivorship bias. And this is going to be one of these videos that I'm going to have to divide into two parts. The reason being, there's so much to say not only about survivorship bias, but how other biases influence the survivorship bias, that there's no way I can just put that into one video. So it's one of the reasons that this is going to be just part one of, again, the series. It's going to be part one and part two for the next week. And I decided to title this Survivorship Bias, Are You Who You Are Thanks to Your Effort? And if you haven't heard of the survivorship bias, this might seem confusing, but I promise it will make sense all in a second. But at first, I want you to think that imagine that you are unfortunate enough to be involved in a car accident. Nothing major happened to you, just some minor injuries. And when asked about why you survived the car accident or you didn't suffer more grave consequences, you start thinking about all of the things that you did. Like, for example, you saw the other car on time. You have very good reflexes because you train sports or whatever it is that you think that causes you good reflexes. You steer the wheel on time. You hit the brake fast enough. All reasons that show how competent you are. Now imagine that you join a therapy group of people who have survived car accidents, if such thing exists, and you hear different voices, different case scenarios, but one thing sticks out to you, that they all seem to recall similar or give credit to same or similar reasons as of why they survived, meaning the people's good reflexes, seeing other cars on time. So after a couple of sessions, you are convinced that you must be part of a group of special type of people because you all seem to have a similar reason why you survive your car accidents. Now, the next thing that I wanted to relate is, are you sure you checked all the possibilities? Meaning, chances are that you did not even think about everything that was involved in that accident. Like, for example, did you think about the road conditions or how there are literally engineers who have been trained and also whose only job is to design good roads so they can minimize both the quantity and the quality of or gravity of accidents. You also perhaps didn't think about your car's built-in safety features. Like, for example, maybe there's some feature that alerts you earlier or they can hit the brakes before you have the capacity to react. Probably you only focus on the people who seem to tell a similar story or stories to yours. It's not your fault, by the way. It doesn't even have to be done on purpose. It's not. Sometimes when we talk about this kind of selection of information, we immediately go into confirmation bias. And I want to tell you that that is not necessarily true. Like, it's not that you're pre-selecting that information because you want to confirm a preconceived idea that you have. Our brain tends to just pay more attention to the things that they can easily recognize, meaning everything that is familiar to our brain is going to be easier to digest. Therefore, it's easier for us to select that information that is familiar. It is easier just for us to pay attention to something that we can recognize easily rather than try to overthink about things that we might not even understand. So again, it doesn't even have to be a form of confirmation bias. It's just that our brain tends to pay more attention to things that are recognizable and forget about those that are not. We have to think this to the selection bias, and I'm going to explain what selection bias is. And I want you to start thinking about confirmation bias as a separate thing. But at the same time, you can consider confirmation bias as a selection bias. And I'm going to give you a little definition of what a of what a selection bias is. I'm definitely going to dedicate a different video to talking about the selection bias. But again, I want to just warn you and try to make that distinction between confirmation bias and selective bias. Selection bias or selective bias, in this case, selection bias from now on, occurs when a person or a group focuses on a particular information and discards other type of information that could potentially be useful or very important. And the difference between this, as I said before, and the confirmation bias is, yes, in both you're going to select information, but in the confirmation bias, you do it with a purpose. And the purpose of confirmation bias is to confirm your preconceived ideas. So selection bias can actually happen naturally, again, because our brain has a harder time at interpreting, and first to even pay attention to the things that we're not familiar with than the ones that, the information that we're familiar with. So since that is much easier, we tend to, again, select, but again, there's no conscious thought on that. And I'm not saying that confirmation bias requires you to be conscious. Like sometimes we pre-select that information that confirms our ideas at an unconscious level. But there's, again, a purpose behind that. While, again, as I said before, selection bias doesn't necessarily have that intention or purpose. Now, this selection bias can be misleading, and it is a source of many problems that might arise during research, for example. Gathering improper data is one of the main problems that you will encounter on any research, and that's one of the reasons why science in general puts such high value in gathering proper data and making sure that you have taken everything into account. Now, incomplete data normally leads to wrong conclusions, obviously, and worse, because of those poor conclusions or even wrong conclusions, it might lead to proposing wrong solutions or even policies that might affect more than one people, or more than one person, right? Now, the next things I titled these, I feel the need for speed, because I want to start that conversations about why are we pre-selecting that? Well, like what's happening behind the scenes? Like, why is it that we have that tendency of pre-selecting that idea and those thoughts in the first place? What makes us pre-select certain information and others? Why is it that we just focuses more on the things that are familiar to us? So if you remember from the first video, when I discussed all the basic information that you need to know in order to understand biases, I also, other than explaining the definitions of biases themselves and where the word comes from, I introduced that idea that Professor Daniel Kahneman, or Dr. Daniel Kahneman, introduced of System 1 and System 2. And if you haven't watched that video, don't worry. I'm going to give you a little fast recalling of what I was trying to say in that video. System 1 is basically a process for which we tend to do snap judgment. So basically is the processes that occur fast, and that is normally attached to things that are easily available to us. And I know that that might sound very complicated, but I'm going to give you an example. If I ask you, what is the color of your car? What is the name of your father? If your brain is normal, meaning if you don't have any neurological disorder, obviously you're going to give a quick answer because that's information that is easily available to you. And in that case, you need to involve any other process in your brain. Like you don't need to double think about what is the color of your car or what is the name of your father. Now, again, System 1 is a speedy system. It is used to give you immediate responses. And this system is used when you have easy access to the information that is required. And System 2 is the more methodical one. Like, for example, the one involved in complex math problems. So if I ask you how much is 32 times 14, you probably are going to have to spend more time than when I ask you what is the color of your car or what is the name of your father, because that is, again, more complicated process that require of other processes to combine that information into getting an answer. Now, although selection bias occurs even when we're using the System 2, and I think that is one of the first mistakes that we do when we're trying to think about snap judgments, you immediately think, well, that is the cause of the selection bias. Well, no, there are sometimes occasions in which you have the time to think about stuff. Again, you're applying your System 2, you are involving other processes or other portions of your brain. So it's a complicated process, but you still select that information. Now, again, the use of System 1 is actually the one that promotes quick answers and snap judgments that can lead to selecting information that appears to our senses. So yes, I said that that selection bias can also occur while using the System 2. but most likely it's going to appear, or at least the system one is going to make it worse. It's actually going to make it much easier for you to fall into that quick snap judgment and to quickly select one information. Now, again, the reason is because that information looks familiar. Now, remember that a sense of familiarity is essential for our well-being. We have discussed also when we were discussing about how our ancestors needed to look for familiarity. And again, that is because they needed to look for ways in which they felt safe. And even when we don't need to feel safe, and this is a clarification that I want to make for this video, that sense of familiarity is always reassuring. Meaning, it's not necessarily a condition. It doesn't mean that you have to feel safe because there's something going on and then you immediately go into, I need to find something safe to make me feel safe mode. And it's not a requirement for you to fall into that selection of information. In this case, it's just that sense of familiarity makes us feel good. So again, it's not necessarily a life and death situation, and that is pretty much with what I have been repeating in past videos. In this case, it doesn't have to even be that extreme. It just makes us feel better. It reassures our well-being. Now, because it activates, again, our deep primitive brain that is always looking for a feeling of safety. But then I want to make that important distinction that I have made in the past between feeling safe and being safe. We're not looking for being safe. We're looking for feeling safe. I know that if I ask you, you probably are going to say, no, I'm looking to be safe. But in reality, what our brain is looking for is that sensation of feeling safe. And sometimes, well, most of the times, that is actually a parallel thing, like meaning you achieve one thing when you achieve the other one, meaning you feel safe and you're safe. But sometimes you are feeling safe, but you are actually not in a safe situation. And that's something that I already have explained in another video. But suffice to say that when that happens, you might actually continue a path that actually doesn't lead to you being safer, but you have the feeling that you're being safe. That is why you continue that path. Now, let's actually dig a little bit more into the brain. And it's going to be a little bit technical, as you probably, if you have watched the other videos, I don't like to go too technical, but there's certain things that are needed in order for you to understand fully what's happening behind the scenes, like what is exactly going on in your brain that produces all these different behaviors. Now, before we even dig a little deeper into the neurotransmitters, which is what I'm going to dedicate this section to, I have to make sure that we all at least understand that neurotransmitters are not causing a particular behavior themselves. I'm going to stop because I know that can be a controversial thing. What it does is that neurotransmitters activate a particular set of neurons. So again, there are receptors in some neurons that are responsive to those neurotransmitters. And when a neurotransmitter and a receptor interact, the combination between the neurotransmitter and those receptors create a response. And normally it's a response, obviously, in a neuron, but a group of neurons working together, remember, a nucleus, can interact with other groups of neurons, other nuclei, and create these different responses, again, in combination between the responses of one group of neurons and the responses of another group of neurons. So when we're talking about what we observe directly, the behaviors that we observe, so that is a combination of different portions of the brain. And those are responses against the interaction between neurotransmitters and particular receptors that are, again, responsive to those specific neurotransmitters. The reason why I want to clarify that is, and I want to clarify that, is because it is also important for us to understand that neurotransmitters are not just everywhere in the brain. There are specific areas of the brain that are, dopamine related areas of the brain, and they respond to the neurotransmitter dopamine. But there are other areas of the brain where you don't find dopamine. Now, it is important again to make the distinction that neurotransmitters are more prone to appear in certain areas of the brain, and that the interactions between neurotransmitter and the receptors is what create the responses. And together, those responses, together with other responses from other parts of the brain, is what we observe as a behavior. Now, although the neurotransmitters, again, dopamine, serotonin, and oxytocin, and I have discussed that in the past, but I'm going to do a brief recap on that, all intervene in our behavior seeking, meaning the idea of looking for something. Oxytocin is actually mostly related to perpetuating the species, meaning it's in charge of behaviors that are related to mating, behaviors that are related to feeding, even to bonding. I will not try to describe the many functions of all of these neurotransmitters, obviously, because honestly, I have no idea about all of them. I just know a few of them. But I'm going to try to make my self clear, at least with these three, and how they interact to create certain behaviors. Now, if you remember when I discussed the dopamine during the Wuzel effect, I actually talk about how the neurotransmitter dopamine sometimes is misunderstood. The dopamine is released in the pursuit of something. So if you have a goal, name your goal, whatever it is, the dopamine is what's making you to continue to pursue that goal, not what is released when you achieve the goal. Now, I talk again about the dopamine as a neurotransmitter in charge of pursuing a particular goal, and that was sufficient then, but I wanted to clarify here that the dopamine also intervenes in one other important element, which is the selection of what is or what are the things that are worth pursuing versus what are the things that are not worth pursuing. And I know that that kind of would be complicated to understand, but I'm going to give you an example. Let's say that you're playing a video game, right? And then the objective, obviously, is to finish the video game, and there are different levels, and each level gets you closer to your goal, meaning that's the goal of finishing the game. And there's a surge, in dopamine every time you finish a level. That is normal because you're getting closer and closer to your goal. So there's a surge of dopamine, and that is what triggers you continuing that behavior. So that is responsible, again, for encouraging you to continue playing, but that is not the only moment in which dopamine participates in your gaming. And that is a distinction that I want to make today that I didn't do during the Wuzel effect because it was not necessarily then. And it's, for example, in the game, let's say that you go to a particular location, you're doing something, you're exploring in the video game, and you obtain a reward. Let's say, for example, that you obtain new lives, or you have more, you expand your life during the game. So within the same level, the next time that you encounter a similar location, your brain will remember when you had your reward, and it will trigger you to go there. So basically, it will say, hey, go to that place because that's actually good for you. So let's say that the opposite happens, and now you go to a different location, and that location actually makes you lose lives or just kills you altogether. Obviously, the next time that you encounter a similar situation, a similar location, your brain will remember as well, and then it will just make you think that that is not something worth pursuing. So again, that behavior of distilling what is important from what is not is actually also in part helped by the dopamine or the effect of dopamine. Now, so in conclusion, dopamine is activated to, one, help us choose a path to achieve a particular goal, and also to select what is worth pursuing and what is not worth pursuing. Now, serotonin is something that I barely discussed in the past, so today I'm going to explain a little bit more, not too much more, but just a little bit more. It's as complex as dopamine. That means that it has different effects, and it's in charge of many brain functions like learning, like consolidation of memories, the sense of well-being. Let's take, for example, the same example that I just gave you before about the video game. So every time you finish a level, there's also a surge in serotonin. That actually is the feeling neurotransmitter that we were discussing. So there's a slightly rush of serotonin that makes you, again, feel good. Now, if you manage, again, to finish the level, and also good for manage to having finished the level, meaning there's some sense of accomplishment because you just finished the level. It's not that you reached the goal, but it's kind of like a mini goal within the entire, or the major goal that you have, which is finishing the game. And again, good that you managed to finish the level, and also good for getting closer to your goal. Now, serotonin, like any other transmitter, depends on the number and availability of the receptors to reproduce their functions. So as I said before, crucial. You have to make the distinction between the neurotransmitter and the receptor. And the reason is because sometimes, I'm not saying this in particular, but for example, in the case of dopamine or even the serotonin as well, yes, there's an example in which different receptors can actually have the opposite effects. So the serotonin can actually activate, let's say, two type of receptors, and one you're going to have one response, and the second one you actually might have an opposite response, or minimize the responses from the first receptor. And I know that that is a complicated, it's a complicated explanation, but suffice to say that in this case, the receptor and the interaction between the receptor and the neurotransmitter is what's actually getting you the responses, not just the neurotransmitter. The neurotransmitter without the receptor doesn't do anything. So again, in this case, we're talking about that if the receptors, for example, are blocked, or there's a decrease in the number of receptors, the function, in this case, the feel good, is minimized, or worse, doesn't even start. So let's say that you're pursuing a goal, and the goal is to finish a game. Let's say for whatever reason you have lower levels of receptors, or there's not enough of serotonin. So obviously reaching that goal will not make you feel anything, because there's the interaction between the serotonin and the receptors that is what you need in order for you to feel that is not there. So an interesting observation about the effect of serotonin has to do with the delay in gratification. Now let's follow the same example that I was giving you before. Imagine that you're playing the same level for hours. Frustrated and then feeling tired, you decided to go to sleep, and then maybe the next day you're going to be better, you're going to have a better luck. The problem is that you try it again the next day, you almost made it, but you didn't, and then you feel equally frustrated. Now days turn into weeks, weeks turn into months, you still haven't finished that level. And then frustrating mounts, and now you're not feeling any pleasure in playing at all. That's an example on how you are going from achieving a goal on like not even responding, because at a neurotransmitter or neuroscience point of view, you basically are not associating that with any surge in serotonin. That means that you're not feeling pleasure anymore. There's no pleasure to have in this case. You keep playing because you feel that you have spent a lot of time already. And now one day, after many, many weeks, you finally made it. You finally do it. So you finish the phase, and it turns out that all these weeks of playing and not having much social activity have made you feel frustrated, sad, depriving you from your happiness. As a way to compensate for this lack of rewards, in general, what our brain does is, let's imagine that your brain needs certain balance like anything else. So if you don't have enough serotonin, let's say that you're not adding enough positive feedback, what happens is that your brain, or the cells in charge of recovering or getting serotonin, they start to produce slightly more number of receptors of that serotonin. That means that your brain is basically saying, hey, we also need to be happy. So since you don't have that amount of serotonin, what I'm going to create is I'm going to create more receptors. So the chances for a connection between the little serotonin that you have in your brain and the receptors is now increased, because there's more chances just by creating more receptors. So now that, again, you have passed all these weeks with no positive reinforcement, not having any interactions with people, now you feel the enormous rush due to the combination of, one, that increase of the number of receptors of the serotonin that I was discussing before, because you didn't have enough serotonin, and also the increase in search of serotonin because you finally finished the game. So what happens is that you feel great. and then you decide to call some friends, and because of that interaction, your serotonin levels increase as well. You feel even better than before. And the question is, does it sound familiar? You probably have encountered a situation in which you were desperate for a very long time. All of a sudden, that is gone. You achieve your goal. That could be like after a test that you have waiting for, studying for weeks and weeks and weeks. Could be a promotion that you were waiting for, being sad at your job for a very long time. And all of a sudden, you have what you wanted for a very long time. And now you feel that rush. Now, that is what I'm going to discuss about serotonin. And finally, I'm going to talk about oxytocin. Again, oxytocin is most commonly related to behaviors that pursue the survival of the species, that is feeding, erection, and other complex behavior related to sex. But I also introduced another word before. There are other behaviors where oxytocin participates. And for example, the feelings we experience while we are bonding with other people, even when we feel trust, are dependent on oxytocin. So the dark side of this is that, or less positive side of oxytocin, has to do with envy. I'm not going to discuss that, but I want to introduce that idea of bonding, or the relationships that you're going to build within your community are partly motivated and created by this increase, or this interaction with oxytocin and receptors. Because remember, there's always oxytocin, there's always the neurotransmitter and the receptors. But I wanted you to have that idea, because later on I'm going to kind of like put everything together and tie it all up, and this will make sense, because all I'm laying down right now is the foundation for you to understand how all of these behaviors are conditioned in part from your neurotransmitter, from your biochemistry, right? Now, the next slide, I'm going to talk about confirmation bias and survivorship bias. And I want to make that distinction even more clear. As I mentioned before, the survivorship bias is a type of selective bias. And it is, again, a confirmation bias. So there are two different things that we have to discuss. One is that obviously selective bias is that umbrella that covers both survivorship bias and confirmation bias. And the second is the relationship between confirmation bias and survivorship bias. Now, as the basis for both, again, we find the need to look for answers that maintain our sense of safety. If you remember, this has been a constant about throughout all these years, in which I always go back to that idea of what our ancestors needed in order to survive. So obviously, once we are exposed to so many dangers, our brain is evolving in a way that can actually look for solutions for that, meaning to try to keep us safe and to avoid danger. And I also said in the past, in other videos, that yes, our brain is actually more wired towards negativity, because that is actually more important for us. It's easier for us to be looking for negative things, because that is the things that we have to protect ourselves against, than looking for positive ones, because we don't have to fear positivity. That's one of the reasons why we're more brain wired to negative thoughts. Now, as the basis for both, as I said, we find the need to look for answers that maintain our sense of safety. Feeling safe and avoiding negative consequences are the cause of many of these behaviors, but they don't attract our attention the same way. Remember that we have a bias towards negativity. That's what I was trying to say before, because that is what we have to protect ourselves against in order to survive. So in choosing between something that is negative that we have to avoid and something fulfilling that can be positive to our lives, believe it or not, our brain is going to choose the negative one, not pursuing something negative, but focus or paying attention to the negative one, because again, our brain needs to protect us from dangers. So that's how we have evolved. So now, that's one of the reasons why when you do something, even if the majority of people around you congratulate you and support you, you tend to focus on that negative or comment, or those negative comments that someone might make, even someone that you don't even know. You might actually give more strength to those thoughts than the incredible amount of people who are around you, supporting you, and the thoughts that they're giving you. Because of our need to survive, and as a coping mechanism, when we feel we are threatened, especially or our beliefs are being questioned, we tend to look for ways to recover our sense of safety. We also have discussed this in the past, especially when we were talking about confirmation bias. Remember that this is the basics for confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is not necessarily something bad. Obviously, it can have bad consequences, but was born out of a necessity for us to look for things that can actually reassert our certainty and our sense of safety. So again, not understanding our surroundings meant death. That's one of the reasons why the first thing that we do is we interpret, we take it all in, and we try to come up with some answers about what's going on, right? But that doesn't mean that those answers are correct. That doesn't mean that my thoughts, the first thoughts that I have in my head, are the correct ones. That just means that we have a necessity to look for things and interpret things quickly to look for safety. So again, that has nothing to do with reality. It has nothing to even to do with being safe. It has to do with the sensation or feeling safe. Now, when choosing a particular piece of information, we tend to pay more attention to the information that is already familiar to us, because our brains have a harder time at dealing with the information that is new to us. Same reason behind. If we have to choose between something that is familiar and something that is not, we're definitely going to choose something that is familiar, because obviously that is something that we don't have to fear. Remember that we're always looking for safety, and that is the reason why we go for something that is familiar to us, or familiar, because we don't have to fear that familiar thing. We know exactly what's happening. Well, something that we have no idea what the consequences are, we probably are not going to focus or pay so much attention to it. Our capacity to integrate new information is also limited, so our brain is inclined already to focus on that information first. So as you can see, there are like two different forces pulling you in the same direction. One is not only that you need to feel safe, but also that our brain has not only a easier time, it has a limited capacity to interpret new things. So obviously, it's a discompensated system, because it's pulling you in the same direction already. That is a basis for selective bias. But to all of these, you add the purpose of trying to find information to confirm your preconceived ideas, because you or your ideas either feel threatened or you feel lost. You can see how now your brain is not only more inclined to look for familiar ideas, is that you, even at an unconscious level, are looking for a particular type of information. So what I'm trying to say in this last paragraph is, yes, we already have this we're prefixed to look for things that are familiar to us. And also we have a harder time at dealing with new information, because we have a limited capacity at dealing with information anyway. So those are two things that are pulling you already in one direction. But if to that we add that idea of looking for information that confirms your preconceived ideas, that makes you even feel safer, then you can tell that we definitely are going to be looking for certain things. And we're now selecting that information that not only is a selection that just happens because, our brain was lazy, it's also because it makes us feel better about ourselves. Now, every time you're looking for that particular information, again, the anticipation, which is the manifestation of the dopamine levels. Again, every time you're looking for a particular information that is going to be good for you, that you anticipate that is going to be beneficial to you, you have a rush in dopamine. The same way that every time you were getting closer to finishing a level, you would, in the video game example, you were feeling that rush of dopamine. The dopamine then kicks in, making you follow certain paths. So again, the dopamine is here to, among other things, making you continue that path. It's basically the neurotransmitter in charge of you pursuing a path to get the goal. Again, it's not what happens with the goal, is the path, is what makes you choose a right path to obtain the goal. Once you find that information, you feel vindicated. Once you find your goal, once you achieve what you wanted, you feel great. Now, that feeling of being right, proven by others, is a manifestation of, among others, the serotonin. So once again, you achieve one goal, whatever that might be, and especially when you have been told that you're not going to do that, it's not possible, that you shouldn't even try, people who were attacking your ideas, but then you felt the support of other people, you started to compare those. Once you achieve that, you feel, meaning that goal that people were telling that you were not going to achieve, you feel vindicated, and that rush or that information, among other things, has to do with the rush in serotonin. Now, family, friends, and society and culture contribute in major ways to the development of the confirmation bias. We have discussed this in the confirmation bias, of course, but also in the in-group bias and the groupthink video that we were discussing. It is important for us to give credit to how important it is for us to have information to allow us to discover the world. Obviously, families, friends, our environment already have a lot of the job for us, meaning we're not just a blank canvas for everything. We have the manifestation of our culture, or the culture of our families, or the culture of our groups of friends embedded into our own thoughts. And obviously that helps us navigate throughout the world. It gives us certain answers to certain questions. It makes our lives easier. But definitely also, if you flip the coin, it also makes you to fall for certain things without having given too much thoughts or too many thoughts into if that is even right or wrong. And precisely because of that, I wanted to start now talking about the effect of culture. Now, culture is one of the most important influences in the development of the survivorship bias. So everything that I have discussed so far has led us at least to this point in which now we can analyze first from a neurotransmitter point of view. We were seeing what's happening that is making you individually to pursue certain goals. When you get that goal, you have the support of certain people, but during the pursuing of that goal, you also have the support of certain people that confirm your preconceived ideas and allow you to continue. But now we have to analyze what happens with the culture. What is that the culture pushes you in one direction and the other one? So again, culture is one of the most important influences in the development of the survivorship bias. Cultures that value hard work and results tend to oversimplify the reasons behind someone's success, especially those who perceive themselves as successful, hardworking people. So if you remember about that first example that I gave you in the video, when I was discussing about your answers against that hypothetical car accident, the answers I was suggesting are things that always look for your competence. You're looking everything from the lens of you and how good you are at something, but it didn't analyze everything. Definitely not all of the possibilities that had influenced the results, right? The same happens at the group level. When you're talking or when you're analyzing the effect of culture or the groups of people, we have the same biases and we have the same skew or the same type of selective or selection bias in which we're selecting at a group level certain information. And then we also have the confirmation bias that proves us as a group right. Now, but why? Why is it that we have this tendency? Why is it that we tend to oversimplify certain things? And why is it that in this case, in this example in particular, we tend to equate hardworking people with success? There's several reasons that I can think of. Again, these are not all, obviously, that these are just a few that I can think of right now. There are many more, but for sake of brevity, I'm just going to give you a couple of them. First, let's focus on the individual. What happens at the individual level? The individual that works hard thinking one day he or she will make it. That is a goal. That is, again, a goal established. Year after year, the person grinds thinking that at some point they will be able to retire with some money to live a comfortable life. This is very similar to the example of the video game that I was telling you about. Well, Yes, there's some moments in which you start with the dopamine, you're getting closer to passing a level. Let's say that with the example of your life, there's certain quote unquote successes that you have throughout your life that makes you think that you're going for the right path. And if you have a rough patch, the same way that with the example of the video game, you don't pass a level for a very long time, you feel frustrated, you don't feel fulfilled, you feel angry sometimes. Same thing happens with life. You might feel unfulfilled, you might feel angry, you might feel frustrated. And then all of a sudden you might reach a point in which you actually make it. That is one way, but what if you never make it? What if with the same examples that I gave you with the video game, you never pass the level? That's it. You continue to play and play. Similar again to the example that I gave you with the person who cannot finish the level at the video game. This person might feel insecure, frustrated, and sometimes angry. The increase in negative emotions and lack of positive ones reflected as a decay in serotonin. Like that is a manifestation of a lower level of serotonin. And that doesn't mean that the person has a neurological disorder that provokes that. That means that there are an increase in negative emotions and a decrease in positive ones. Now, unfortunately for this individual, there's no shortage of people showing you how they made it. Nowadays, and with the continuous messages from social media, we focus on people who, via filter, and I'm not talking about getting a beautiful filter, I'm talking about like filtering how their life really is, shows us a very skewed version of themselves. On the other side of the screen, this person, meaning the person who's feeling frustrated, is incapable of distinguishing between reality, meaning the real person that is showing that, and the internet persona. The person decides to believe that there is a way to make it, meaning based on what that person sees. And I feel like in the past, it used to be just people that you saw on the internet, but you didn't know. But sometimes this even happens with friends of yours, friends that you maybe aren't that close, or friends that you're close, but you haven't asked them about certain aspects of their lives, and you think that their lives is wonderful because of the pictures that they post, the trips that they seem to be enjoying every 2 or 3 months. So all of that gives you a sense of that people already have, that those people already have made it. When in reality, those people maybe are suffering. Maybe those people are posting that to boost their own self-esteem and making themselves to feel better. But you don't question that. You don't think that. You think immediately that they might have been doing something right that you are not. So this person then decides to believe that there is a way to make it, that somehow or he or she must be doing something wrong, since so many others are, quote unquote, making it. These interviews, these intertwines with the other side of the coin, the society. Again, we were talking about what happens at the individual level, and I give you just an example. But what happens with the society? The individual does not live by himself. You cannot just make everything out of nowhere. You don't have the capacity to make your water appear. You didn't build your house. Probably, maybe you did. You didn't definitely build your car. So we definitely depend on others. Now, society, or should I say the culture around the individual, has sets of values. Remember the groupthink and in-group bias video. In this case, I clarify those and why is it important. And sometimes the individual who belongs to the group gives so much importance to the values of the groups because the groups actually protect, or the person feels protected by the group, that the individual has the need to protect the beliefs of the group even more, even over his own beliefs. Sometimes certain beliefs, especially those that are not so deep, might be overridden by the beliefs of the group, because again, the individual feels that there's so much that he or she is gaining from the group that attacking the group can have extremely grave consequences. Now, being alone used to mean death or a loss of quality of life. That's why those values, the beliefs of the group, need to be protected. Because again, belonging to a group is something that our ancestors learned that it was the quickest way to prolong your life, because you now have the the protection of others, the knowledge of other people. Now, questioning the values of a group leads to more questioning, which can bring more anxiety and the sense of a loss that most people cannot handle. So again, it's not even necessarily that you're afraid of that particular issue. It's more like, well, if I start questioning this, what other things are wrong with the group? What other things are wrong that I don't know about? So obviously that might actually trigger or lead to a vicious cycle of questioning your own beliefs, and that promotes more anxiety. So as I always say, you have to find a balance between questioning the reality and also feeling good. And sometimes you might have to recognize, now I don't have the time, or I don't have the fortitude to confront this, because confronting this would literally mean an anxiety attack, for example. On the other hand, the culture of a particular group tries to promote values that are believed to be beneficial for the majority of the group. Working hard is, in essence, actually a good value. I'm not going to criticize, obviously, working hard. I try to work as hard as I can myself. So this is not an attack on working hard. The problem is when we equate hard working with success and we relate them as a condition that must happen in order to get the other, and that we cannot separate them. And I think that is my pet peeve with this bias in particular. It is because of this pressure from society that these beliefs are not questioned more often. Again, I don't want to be out of a group. I don't want to be ostracized from the group. And I know that if I criticize openly working hard, many people are going to stop supporting me. And what does that mean exactly? Well, definitely if there's someone who will hire me, potentially the person is not going to hire me if he or she is listening to me ranting about working hard and how bad it is. So it's one of the reasons why a lot of people don't even question that idea. But again, the idea is that we have to question is not working hard. We know that working hard is not necessarily a bad thing, although there's some degrees in which some might argue that there's such a thing as working too hard. The idea is not criticizing that, it's criticizing the idea that both have to be met in order to, working hard is a must for you to be successful. Now, the next thing I wanted to talk, and I wanted to start with a question. How many delivered worker billionaires do you know? Now, single parents working 3 jobs, taxi drivers, construction workers, fishermen, delivery workers. Those are just a few examples that I can think of that, despite being, among the hardest working people that I can hear, these workers tend to stay in the lower and middle class. It's not like working harder by putting in more hours simply is going to change that. It's just not going to make much of a difference. Then there's the argument, because that's the first argument, right? The first argument is that, well, if you work harder, it's like, well, working harder in terms of making more hours, it's just not going to change that reality. And the people who might hire them for those positions need them for those positions. So they might not need them for anything else. They want them to do exactly those things. But again, that is a trap, because then the person cannot do anything else unless that the person decides to have, again, an extra job. Then there's the argument about skills and value. That is what most people actually say. Well, it's not necessarily about working hard. It's just that you study, for example, hard for many years, and then obviously or learn new skills. And then because of your grinding and making or getting new skills, then you're worth paying more. Some people argue that the skills necessary, for example, to perform the jobs that I was describing before, like taxi drivers, they're just simply not enough to pay more money. But if we argue about skills and how these skills relate to a particular amount of money, it would be just impossible for me to justify such a difference between a CEO that's making millions of dollars per year and a taxi driver that makes $40,000 a year. It's just simply, there's no skill that is so much more valuable. It's just not possible to be much more valuable than that. There are, however, differences between the skills necessary, for example, to drive a car, than the ones needed to perform open heart surgery. there's no doubt a person has to go through an intense training for many years, decades, in order for them to feel competent to do these type of surgeries, obviously. But I feel that the real reason why some people get paid more than others is because, and I'm going to give you a surprising response, is that because they get paid more money. I know that that sounds silly, and for me, it's just simply that's it. I know that you probably are disappointed by this answer, but this is all I can honestly be said about it. It's just that we pay more because we pay more, and there's nothing else. It's not something that is logic. It might be logical for things that we already have established, but again, we made those up. We made what people need to be paid. Now, if you're not convinced about that answer, if you're not convinced about the reasoning behind that, I'm going to give you an example. And this has to do with the next scene, a violinist in the subway. I don't know if you know this story, but in 2007, the Washington Post invited virtuoso violinist Joshua Bell to play in a subway station during rush hour. The experiment tried to show that people would recognize beauty and see the value of famous artists, even if they didn't recognize the artist in particular, and calculated that he, the violinist in this case, would make at least $100 in tips, and that between 75 or 100 people will stop by and ask or listen to the person. Now, the shocking and demoralizing reality is that only 6 people actually stopped and listened to, and he, meaning the violinist, only earned $32 for his performance. Even more shocking than all of this is that this took place only a few days after he had played a concert where the worst seats were $100 minimum. Although I will have a different video covering the topic of value, suffice to say that value depends on the service given, obviously, but it also depends on the willingness of people to pay a certain amount of money for that service. Now, without a proper context, we're really bad at calculating the value of anything. In most cases, I would argue that value is just made up. This is, if there's no past experience with a particular service and the cost attached to that service, it's just very difficult for us to make a proper assessment. We just have a hard time at giving things value. Sometimes we overpay for things simply because we don't understand what it took to make that thing in particular, or for that service to take place. And sometimes we actually pay very little. Sometimes we're mad because people are trying to charge us what we believe not to be a fair price, because we think that we should pay less for a particular service because simply we just don't understand what it takes to make that thing or to create that service. Now, I'm going to give you a sentence and I want you to think for a second. IKEA is more valuable than Herman Miller. All right, so now that you thought, and if you don't know who Herman Miller was, he was a famous designer, especially I think in the 50s. His basic desk go for about like $3,000 and up. So again, that's the most basic type, kind of like this, but obviously not. This is not a Herman Miller, but something like this by Herman Miller will cost you like $3,000. Now, imagine that you buy one of these $3,000 desks, and 5 years later you decide to sell the desk for $2,500. So again, you purchase for $3,000. You think, well, it's been 5 years, and obviously the value has decayed over time because I actually have used it as well. That actually kind of like seems reasonable, right? Like seems like you have used something, it costs you that amount of money. So obviously there's some depreciation for that. You also have another desk you bought at IKEA that cost you $200 around the same time. And you decide to sell these for $250. Now, after all, you start thinking that you put that together. This is called the IKEA effect. And yes, there is, believe it or not, there is a bias that uses the name IKEA. And the idea behind the IKEA effect is that we tend to give a higher value to those things where we participated in the making. Meaning if you are building your IKEA, you put some hours, you give that a higher value than someone else putting together desks. So instead of just selling it for, I don't know, $200, which is what it costs, you sell it for $50 more because it's like, well, it was not built. I have to make it. And if someone else buys it, probably that person would have to buy it for more money. So at the core of this idea is the idea of competence. Now, don't get me wrong, the idea of self-efficacy and competency is necessary for our well-being, and that is good. That is great. So this is not necessarily a bad thing. In fact, our beliefs about our capacities to perform well and exert control over our lives is necessary for our mental health. Research actually shows that people who believe in their efficacy are better at coping better with challenges, are less vulnerable to suffer for certain problems or suffer from stress or depression. And also, and as a consequences of all of this, it is not a surprise that also these people tend to be more motivated to do things. So let me recap, and this is going to be the end of this video. Keep in mind that I know this is just kind of like offering you one piece, and you need the second side, the second piece to put it together. Otherwise, it will not make a lot of sense. But keep in mind that because it's a lot of information, you will need to watch this video first and the second one after. Now, let me recap. Our brain has an easier time recognizing and processing information that already is familiar. That creates a bias towards certain types of information. This is an unconscious process, meaning you don't participate in that consciously. Also, our brain, you can also do it consciously. You can actually select certain information, but there's no requirement for it to be constant. You don't have to pay attention for it to happen. Also, our brain tends to make snap judgments. It would be very complicated for us to deal with the reality. If we had to analyze every single step we make as if it was a complicated math problem. So imagine just, deciding what I don't know, mouthwash do you have to buy, and then taking like 45 minutes because it's so complicated for you. Obviously, life would be extremely important. So that's why we turn to use snap judgments for that. The neurotransmitter dopamine makes us pursue a particular path to achieve a goal. And once we achieve that goal, we feel a rush of serotonin, the feel-good neurotransmitter. This factor alone conditions certain types of behaviors. Since we have a need to feel safe, we constantly look for information and people that confirm our points of view. The people around us and the culture we're part of also have enormous influence in the way that we behave. Remember that our family is actually together in that group, because that's actually the first quote unquote culture that we learn, the culture of our family. Since it is hard for us to survive alone, we tend not to confront our group's beliefs out of fear of being expelled from the group. If the group you're part of, or your culture, or the culture of the group, equates hard work with success, the logical conclusion when someone is not successful would be their lack of hard work. And since that belief is a powerful one, it is difficult to challenge it without facing negative consequences. So I want to stop right now. Before I finish, I want you to think about one thing. This is, again, and I don't want this to be confused as an attack on hard work. This is an attack the belief that one thing needs to lead to the other one, meaning that hard working must equate to success. And also, the successful people are extremely hardworking people. Although it is true that plenty of successful people have worked super hard, think about all these people that I was telling you about, people who spend 20 years, 30 years working hard, being in a taxi, or fishermen, or any other people that you can think of, extremely hardworking people that never made it and were extremely hardworking. And then think about all of these people who just make money because they were fortunate enough to inherit certain money, invest in stocks, and then that's what they do for a living. Obviously, those are examples of in both extremes of how those two are not equal and how you should not put them together. So again, I want you to think about that before you watch the next video, hopefully next week. But the most important thing is that you continue thinking that this is not an attack on hardworking or even in successful people. It is an attack on that belief that one needs to happen for the other. One needs to occur for the other to happen. So as usual, thank you so much for watching this video. I hope this is useful. In this case, this is just part one. See you in the next week with part two. Thank you so much.